the past few years, the seemingly insignificant region of Central Asia has been thrust into the spotlight as it is now the site of a battle for influence amongst great powers. A formerly Russian-dominated region is now being won over by the up-and-coming global power China as it rests on the crossroads of the world. So what has happened to this area, and what is its future? The region of Central Asia, long a point of confluence amongst Islamic, Chinese, and Turkic cultures, had its modern history begin with the Russian conquests of Central Asia, in which the Russians pushed south as far as modern-day Afghanistan. These conquests stopped when the British, fearful that the Russians might encroach on British India, created the Afghan Boundary Commission to demarcate the border of the buffer state Afghanistan. The political situation only changed during the Russian Civil War, and the whole region fell under Soviet hands when the Soviets drove the Russian whites out in 1924. Under the Soviets, the region gained its modern-day borders, and after the collapse of the USSR, the various Central Asian nations have differed greatly in what both their political and economic systems are. While this historical overview is by no means exhaustive, it is sufficient to understand the great power dynamics of the region. So what are the main positions and the goals of both Russia and China? Starting off, Russia has numerous political, economic, and social links to the Central Asian region. Russia is the de facto head of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a military alliance of most Central Asian states. The CSTO is vital for Russia as it feels that the best way to exert influence in the region is by means of being the security guarantor, in the same way that NATO is a means for projecting power in Europe. Because of the expansion of rival security networks such as NATO and the Chinese Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia is very uncomfortable with other militaries operating in what it considers as its sphere of influence. Russia also has deep economic ties in the area as Russian state-owned oil companies own energy pipelines. Russia, along with other post-Soviet states, have formed an economic union, the Eurasian Economic Union, which is similar to the EU and seeks to integrate the economies of the post-Soviet states, especially those in Central Asia. The union plans to introduce a common currency by the mid-2020s. Another source of influence that Russia has is the vast amount of Central Asian workers who work in Russia. These workers' remittances, or the money they send back to their home countries, account for a large share of GDP for Central Asian states. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, remittances account for 30% of the country's GDP. This means that a huge portion of the Central Asian economies are reliant on Russian businesses and are ultimately reliant on Russia. With all these factors in mind, Russia has strong economic leverage on the Central Asian states. An additional factor regarding Russian interests in Central Asia is its large Russian minority. This is especially true in Kazakhstan, where they make up over 19% of the population. Even though Putin is an autocrat, it is important for him to keep popular support, and the condition of Russians abroad is very important to the Russian public, as the conflict in Ukraine has shown. With these factors in mind, Russia's main goal regarding Central Asia is to maintain its economic and political influence that it once had in abundance, and to protect its Russian minorities in the post-Soviet states. China, the other main power in Central Asia, is seeing its influence blossom. Firstly, China opened one of its first overseas military bases in Tajikistan in 2016. Also, all Central Asian states, except Turkmenistan, are part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, a massive investment program aimed at influencing many Eurasian nations. As a consequence, China is creating multitudes of infrastructure projects in Central Asia aimed at coaxing these countries. The reason for all this development is twofold. The first is that China wants these countries' help in combating Uyghur separatism. In the past few years, China's crackdown of Uyghur activism has caused many influential Uyghurs to flee to Central Asia. In order to clamp down on resistance from abroad, China seeks to court Central Asia to get them to extradite these dissidents. For example, in March 2019, Serzakhan Balash, a Uyghur rights activist, was arrested in Kazakhstan for quote-unquote inciting hatred, most likely at the behest of Beijing. China's second goal is to economically integrate Central Asia into its One Belt, One Road policy. This policy would help Central Asia to become more integrated with China's economy due to the infrastructure projects and financing directly from Beijing. Because many Central Asian countries' main exports are natural resources, they will be able to cheaply supply Beijing with the energy and mining resources it needs. Meanwhile, this trade balance would cause these states to become dependent on the myriad goods and services that only China could supply. With states that are reliant on China for economic prosperity, it would be in their self-interest to follow China both politically and economically. So what is the likely future of Central Asia? The most likely outcome is that Central Asia will become more aligned with China as it expands economically in the region. Since the 1990s, trade between China and Central Asia has exploded, growing from less than $1 billion to then over $30 billion by 2019. As the Belt and Road Initiative continues, large infrastructure projects in the region and economic aid will sway Central Asian countries towards Beijing. Because of Beijing's advance into what Russia sees as its sphere of influence, competition between Russia and China is likely to grow in the coming years. One area of competition between the powers is economic. As China expands its One Belt, One Road policy into Central Asia, this leaves Russia with significantly less influence over the region. China will also upset Russia with its continuous building of pipelines in the region. Since China is one of the largest importers of natural gas from Russia, its new pipelines in Central Asia could undercut its demand from Russia, leading to a loss in a vital Russian industry. The biggest source of tension amongst Russia and China is in the security sphere. While Russia has traditionally contented itself as Central Asia's security guarantor, that dynamic is changing rapidly as China expands in the region. As China has sought to protect its economic investments, it has expanded militarily in the region, much to the chagrin of Russia. In the meantime, as Russia is being sidelined in Central Asia by its much larger neighbor, it will see its influence diminish greatly, like it has seen in Eastern Europe with the expansion of NATO. Given the severity that Russia considers this lack of influence, as was shown by the annexation of the Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine, only time will tell what measures Russia will do to regain its former strength.